Hey, I'm Mike Joseph, and thank you for listening to Detoxicity, a show by men, about men, but for everyone. I hope you enjoy the content of this podcast, and I want to let you know about a few things you can do to support us and our mission to challenge traditional notions of masculinity and create a more communicative, positive, and loving environment for all. You can subscribe to Detoxicity on any podcast platform that you use to listen. We are available just about everywhere. Also, don't hesitate to rate and comment, as these help us move up in the podcast rankings. I'm on social media, or at least I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok as DetoxPod Guy. Feel free to drop me a follow. Now I have a Patreon page, yay! And Patreon gives you the opportunity to get cool merch and exclusive episodes of this podcast in exchange for subscribing. Go to patreon.com/detoxicitypod to find out more. Finally, I'd love to hear from you. Whether you found an episode of the podcast particularly enjoyable or enlightening, or you know someone who'd be a great guest, or you'd like to offer constructive criticism, or if you yourself would like to be on the podcast, hit me up. Reach out to me at one of the aforementioned social media channels, or if you're old school like I am, drop me an email, detoxpod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and take care. So, if you are a regular listener of this podcast, you might be aware of the fact that I get introduced to a lot of guests from other guests. And in this case, Mark Marshall, who is a fantastic, wonderful person and the subject of this particular episode, I was introduced to him via my friend Luke Wesley, who has been on this podcast twice and is also a wonderful human being. Wonderful human beings introduce other people to wonderful human beings. And Mark is an amazing musician, plays multiple instruments, plays guitar, plays drums, has an incredible musical mind, far beyond my comprehension. And in addition to just being a tremendous musician, he is a professor, he is a composer. He is someone who has grown up with a lot of challenges and has such a great attitude about all that stuff. And he also hosts a podcast. He hosts a podcast called Anatomy of Tone. And we actually don't talk about that during this conversation, but we talk about so much more. Everything from, again, growing up with a disability, to having a narcissistic parent, to anxiety, which I am certainly well versed on. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Again, it is just a warm conversation with a great person, and Mark is a super interesting guy. So, everybody, here is Mark Marshall.
Okay. Well, my name is Mark Marshall. I originally am from a small town in northeastern Pennsylvania. It's a valley, and so there are a bunch of small towns that are connected to one another in a region. And there's sometimes a distinguishable border between towns. It's a big coal mining area, so like these little, I guess almost little towns or like little villages at one time. I spent a lot of time moving around between the little towns that were there when I was small. We didn't stay put for very long. In fact, in my Brooklyn apartment, it's the longest I've ever lived in one space. So that environment in Pennsylvania was kind of it's a depressed area. The coal mining industry had fizzled out, and they didn't bring anything else in to stimulate the economy. And in 1972, they suffered a flood which devastated the area. It was just a complete disaster, and it was connected to Agnes, which was a hurricane at the time. And it was a lot of blows for the area and the valley, and I think it never survived. So it was kind of in some ways a rough area financially for a lot of people, and education and a lot of those things suffered there. So I lived in several of the areas, and I think experienced, I guess, among the different financial classes that were there of what life was like. I started as a musician pretty young. I started playing around with instruments when I was like 5 or 6. I became very serious about playing musical instruments when I was about 13 or so. And I just really got deep into it. Living in Pennsylvania was challenging for me in a number of different reasons. I grew up with some disabilities. I am legally blind, which people will always ask about. And it means I can see, but I can't see well enough to drive. If I'm standing on a street corner, it's hard for me to see the name of a street from across on the sign. So I have to hold books really close to my face. I made going to school challenging, communicating with people challenging. I was also born deaf in one ear. So there were some challenges living in an area where you couldn't really get anywhere by car. And as I got older, that became more and more challenging in that area because I was very isolated and I didn't get to be around a lot of other musicians and such. And it turned out that my home life was rather challenging. I lived with a narcissist and who I didn't know what that term meant at the time or the serious effects that it can have. So I was kind of trapped in this strange situation, but really wanting to study music more. And eventually, in my late 20s, I reached a breaking point. I didn't go to college. I dropped out of high school. I got my equivalency of my GED and studied music at home, built a home studio. I learned how to play multiple instruments. I learned how to become a recording engineer. I got composition. That eventually led me to I started learning just how to produce music and stuff. And I was working with my dad, it was the problematic figure in the family, and that just reached a point where I had to turn on the self-survival button because I had some sort of awareness that I was being destroyed in the situation, but I couldn't necessarily put my finger on it because I didn't know what a narcissist was, and he did a very good job of isolating me and my mom from other people. So it wasn't like I had a lot of contrast in being like, what's a normal family situation look like? And this is somebody I was creatively working with. Luckily, I eventually got around a couple people that started saying something's not right, which hadn't never happened anywhere else in my life, not even from who I considered my best friends at the time, right? I eventually got into some local cover bands, and one of them was a very successful one. And I took the money from that, and this is like a 3-year maybe process of me starting to get gigs and moving to New York City. I started making enough money, and one of the things I did is I came to New York City, and I didn't know anybody here. I came here cold and just tried to start getting gigs, even when I was living in Pennsylvania, gigs at venues. And I early on, I just by chance, I met somebody who needed help with their guitar in a venue, and I helped them out, and we became really close friends. We're close friends to this day. And she introduced me to Brooklyn, taught me a lot about Brooklyn. I put a deposit on an apartment, and I got out of my situation, which still took me years to understand the gravity of the situation, or even the gravity of like my disabilities or what my prior life had been like. Um, I came to New York City. I started finding work as a professional musician fairly quickly because I had a lot of experience. So I was able to start getting work as a side musician for people. I just started working in recording studios and eventually just touring with a lot of artists and making records with people. And I met my wife, who was from the same area. Actually, we didn't know each other in Pennsylvania, but we knew some of the same people, and so it was kind of funny that we had never crossed paths in that area. But then we met in Brooklyn, in Windsor Terrace, a place called the Crossroads Cafe. So it was kind of strange that happened, and we made a record together. And during the making of the record, we fell in love. It was a great disarming experience to get to know somebody and know them on a personal level without having your guards up, which you normally do when you're dating, and you're only kind of letting so much information out. I think we really got to know each other and who we were. And through that time we still make music together. We have a couple of projects that we work on together, and we both also still work as private teachers and musicians for other people, as well as our own projects. And through my time in New York, I've also expanded and I've become a composer for film and TV, as well as I'm now a professor at SUNY Purchase, which I teach one day a week up there for that with master classes, which has really been an amazing experience. And I teach at the Brooklyn Conservatory, and it's interesting because I never went to school for music, but I spent a lot of time being educated on music. I became really, really infatuated with learning, and I found some really amazing mentors, which really aligned well with my way of learning because of my disabilities. And we've but have a great apartment, and we're pretty lucky to maybe not have a lot of the financial riches, but we have a lot of quality in our life of we're happy where we live. We have great friends. We have a great relationship. We inspire each other, and we're just trying to work and progress every day.
It's what makes you happy, right? Well, trying not to generalize. The idea that financial wealth will make you happy is so common, but is such a falsehood. And even the fact that it's a falsehood is common, is
Mhm.
common knowledge. Um, there's such a strange disconnect between people who want quality of life and people who think that financial stability. I mean, and I do think financial stability brings you a certain level of comfort. But being rich, I don't think makes you any happier than not being rich. I don't have any knowledge of that. I've never been rich. But um, you look at the news, and most rich people seem really uh, miserable.
Mhm.
So I feel like there are things that add to quality of life that are not money that are as important or more important than money. But I'm already going on a tangent. You
Yeah, I mean that's an
brought
interesting topic, right? Because that's what we're often raised to believe with this capitalistic infrastructure that we have, right? Is money makes you happiness more and more and more, and to some of that degree, I was raised on this philosophy of fame and money being the determination of success, and so it took me a long time to, I think, reestablish what my actual relationship was with music and what success means, and I started working and being around people that were very successful, like in the music industry, like some were like music legends and people on that caliber, and one thing that became clear was that neither of those things, the money or the status, necessarily meant happiness. Not to say all of them were unhappy, but it was clearly like being that close to the inner circle was not just like, oh, this is utopia, right? This is where everything happens if you win a couple Grammys and you're famous, and it just wasn't that way at all. And I really had to reassess, I think, what my relationship was with my art in that way.
right. So you brought up so many things that I want to explore. I almost don't know where to start, but let's begin with your childhood and also becoming aware of the disabilities that impact your life. You and I are about the same age,
Hmm.
and I feel like probably in the late '70s and early '80s, people didn't have the skills or the language to deal with disability the way that people do now.
Right. Very
So
much.
yeah, I'm just wondering what that experience was like for you. I mean, you did mention that it was very isolating, but I guess from like a family perspective, and then also from a peer perspective, what was it like? I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I would imagine that you would have just kind of felt like the odd guy out.
Yeah, definitely. It was strange on a couple of different perspectives looking back on it. I think one of them is looking at the way the educational system dealt with it, and they just didn't know how to deal with it. They wanted to put me in specialized classes. My parents didn't want to do that. They wanted me to just kind of be in regular classes, which I can't really honestly say if that's right or wrong. But the problem with some of the specialized classes, like sometimes I would go to a private tutor meeting or something, and they were trying to teach me how to lip read because I was deaf in one ear. Now my hearing is almost perfect in my other ear, but it didn't really make a lot of sense to teach somebody who's legally blind how to lip read. So it was just the
That just occurred to me. Oh
it's
yeah.
like, I mean, I could see if we're sitting across from each other, I could see your lips, but it was hard, right? Because I'm part albino. And when I was younger, my hair was like almost white, and I was a lot lighter skinned. So, and I have is my eyes are very sensitive to light, and they have stigmatism, they can't focus, and thus I'm legally blind. So um, it just didn't help. You know what I mean? It was like, why am I here? So it was they didn't know how to deal with it, and so in some essences they were trying to treat me like my condition was worse than it was, and at other times they really couldn't figure out how to acclimate me. In school, they would always be like, well, you could come up and sit right next to the blackboard and write your notes down. But who wants to do that in a class? I mean, wherever kids are, I think you end up around a lot of bullies anyway. Where I grew up, it was tough. I mean, kids were they were not very accepting of anybody that was different, period, and also the times weren't very accepting. So already being very fair skinned, I already took a lot for being the odd person out. And on top of that, it was the eyesight thing. And if I had, so I would not end up moving myself closer if I couldn't see notes. And I think it affected my engagement with school, and affected my engagement with you know people. I think even eye contact, being able to communicate, take on visual symbols, signals from people, right?
Mm.
Like when you're communicating with somebody. I think a lot of that was challenging when I dropped out and I got my home diploma, and I found out I did much better because I liked reading literature, and I was reading Edgar Allan Poe and Hemingway, and it was like, wait a minute, I'm kind of enjoying education, but I didn't like it in that situation. I think some of it had to do with the disabilities, but it was kind of a strange time. I just didn't. I think one of the problems with public education is like you're supposed to fit into a box, right? This person
Mm.
goes into this box, this person goes in that box, and I think as we get more evolved, we realize that education and learning doesn't really work that way, or not effectively. And so I think I struggled with that in the '80s and right up until high school, and it was challenging.
I wonder if the issue then, and since I don't have access to the public school system the way it is now, I wonder if the issue is that they tried to fit everybody into the same box as opposed to trying to fit everybody into different boxes.
Yeah, they tried to. It's like, oh, if you have a disability, everybody goes in the disabled box, and if you're quote normal, then everybody goes in this box.
Right,
And they really
yes.
wish everybody fit together. You know what I mean? And well, then there's the normal class, which was a mixture of all kind of people that I don't even know what's normal anyway, right? It's just a
Right,
weird designation, but and that was sort of the conveyor belt philosophy of public school in the '80s and '70s, '80s, and probably '90s, and maybe even to the same degree now, depending on
right,
where you are.
right, right. Yeah, I think location, geography has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Um, I, so I don't know if we even discussed this before. I'm assuming that there is an elder in your family, it might be your dad, that is musical, and that's why you took to music from such a young age.
Yeah, my dad is a musician. Um, I mean, that's such a complicated situation. He was somebody that always wanted to be, I think, a famous musician, particularly a rock star. He was really fixated on that. So I was around music as a young age. He would gig a little bit and take me to nightclubs when I was small, like 5 or 6. I was going to nightclubs and being around music, and I think I just became attracted to music. And at first, when I was younger, it wasn't really so much a toxic thing being around him, but he eventually. I mean, there were things brewing there. Of course, I didn't know, but I didn't initially understand or visually take on the negative connotations of some of the behaviors. But as I got older, his dysfunction with music and career uh, really kind of uh, was bad. But when I was young, I was exposed to drums. He's a drummer, so I drums were my first instrument and what I started with, and then learned guitar and stuff. So I was around music a lot from an early age.
And clearly, your attraction to music sort of went beyond just it being introduced to you by a relative. Like seems like it quickly went past you living someone else's dream and it becoming your dream, like becoming like the thing that you, Mark, were about, as opposed to just learning from your father in that respect.
Yeah, I don't know what the term would be, but I guess there's different people that have different levels of emotional sensitivity. And I think I'm kind of like a pincushion. I take on a lot, and I found music was a place to let that out, and so a lot of times when I'm writing music, I'm actually writing a feeling, and if I have to create something that's similar to a genre of music, one of the first things that allows me to do that is I try to tap into what the feeling of the music is and maybe what the person was feeling when they write it. It's not directly the lyrics or the technical stuff, which I also understand. My first thing is just, how does this make me feel? How am I going to convey this feeling? And so that seemed to be a good place for me, because I definitely think, I don't know if emotionally imbalanced is the right word, but I definitely feel a lot. I don't have thick skin, and I think I found that was just a good place for that. Yeah.
And did that always come from playing music, or did it come from listening to music as well?
Being able to sense the feeling.
Yeah.
Um,
Or actually, you being able to feel something yourself?
it's a really blurry, like where that shifts, because I think I was listening to records and buying records when I was like 5 or something. And so I still remember hearing those songs and it evoking emotional experience of that time. And then I think pretty early on in my playing, I was able to adapt that into my playing. So I never remember it being a conscious thing. I just remember it being like a thing that was just always there. And I think that was like the same thing with composition and stuff. I somehow understood that I could just compose music. Like, I didn't really understand why everybody couldn't. It was just like breathing air or something, or and because I didn't really have a contrast of it not being there, I learned how to do it. But somehow, even before I did it, I seemed to have a sense of awareness that I could do it.
What's really interesting to me, I've always wished that I could compose music. Always wished that I had the ability to like compose lyrics or hear an original song in my head, and I can't. So you saying that you thought that it was a quality that everybody had, I just kind of am circling back to myself, and I'm like, man, that's a quality that I don't have, but I wish I did.
Right.
Yeah. Um, so you were gigging pretty early. I'm wondering if you always had the mindset of I'm going to play until I get the fuck out of this place.
No, because I didn't living in the environment I was in, I I didn't know what a narcissist was. I didn't really understand a lot of things about what toxic environments were like. I didn't understand them until years after I was out. I mean, it was really my wife Abby who really helped me understand a lot of that, and really kind of, she was the bridge to me coming from that environment, having a sense of I needed to get out, but then really understanding of why I needed to get out. So even when I got out, I didn't even know why I needed to get out. I just felt it. So I didn't know, but at one point I knew I had to, and so I started gigging more seriously. Up until that point, I was pretty cut off from people. When I was still in high school, I went to a few musical summer camps, but then when I started working with my dad, I was discouraged from doing that because we had to, I had to stay in the home and be very isolated, and it turned into um, I wouldn't call it a cult thing, but there's certain similarities to that kind of mindset of some of the stuff that was happening. So it became a self-survival thing eventually for me to get out, and then later on through therapy and diagnosis, to kind of started to understand what was really going on. I was lucky I had that self-protection circuit somewhere.
Some people are born with that button. With I guess just for the sake of explanation and even for my clarification, what is narcissism and how did that play out in your life?
Well, it's a complicated diagnosis, I think, that I'm still trying to understand, but for the particular situation I was in, it was it was somebody who everything had to revolve around them, right? They could never be wrong. They would be right in no matter what, and sometimes their methods of doing it were via shaming or gaslighting. It was the build you up, break you down kind of philosophy. So sometimes it would be like you're really great, and then other times it would be like you're nothing. You know what I mean? Like you'll never be anything, or never remembering things like arguments. Like, I never said that, and you just be like completely oblivious to having ever said anything. There's usually a lot of emotional abuse that comes with that, right? And tactics to make you feel dependent on them, and everything is about them. They have to have full control of every situation. Um, so it was a lot of that with the family stuff, but it also became like that with the music stuff, like controlling things. And we could never finish a project, for example, because every time it would get close to it, we'd tear it down and rip it apart again because he couldn't ever be secure with his own playing, but then would blame me for it. Or we could never do a song that didn't have drums on it because that was the instrument he played. So I could never write like an instrumental piece because it didn't, you know what I mean? It didn't have drums on it. And I mean, there's a long list of things that are a lot more sinister that got a lot darker, but it was just a lot of control. And there was a lot of control of like isolating family, like keeping family away. Right. So it was very like no friends, no family, negativity about every other single person in their life. Right. Like, everybody was never good enough, never better than they were, right? Never not anybody. It was always trash talking about anybody loving your life. So we became pretty distant from my grandparents and stuff like that. It was a tool devised to a method devised to keep separated, right? So yeah, a lot of things like that that were pretty destructive, emotionally. And that's a hard thing to track too, because a lot of people don't see emotional abuse, right? So
Right.
but it was heavy a lot. Just the graphic nature of things that he would say sometimes were pretty intense. We would have to move houses sometimes within like a few days. Like we'd be like, okay, well, we have to move in a week, and we'd just move to a completely different place. And like, it was
Really?
like, yeah, it was a little chaotic at times, our lives, So there was a lot. It was very testing, I think, and once I started to become interested in music and natural to some degree, I believe that he saw me as being his ticket to his dream. And so a lot of things kind of revolved around that, of pressure and belittling, just a lot of controlling things around that, and preaching and what was interesting is when I came to New York, I had to relearn what I thought I knew about the music business, because a lot of the things that were preached to me were not true at all. Like, you really had no idea how the music business actually worked at all. But when I came to New York, I was convinced that that was the way it worked, and it
Right.
just didn't. From everything from going into a recording studio and working with artists and working with labels, all that stuff was not at all. It was sort of almost a story that he can talk. It was almost like a story that he invented just to be able to give himself some security or something, or to remain in power over me or other people. So I had to relearn a lot about life and the business that I was trying to professionally uh, dig into deeply.
Right. So moving ahead, you're doing these gigs, you're in a band, you're doing all this stuff. What eventually brings you to New York?
I always was fascinated with New York City. So I grew up on Sesame Street, and also like watching TV and films in the 80s, New York City in the 80s. I was always fascinated with, like, it just seemed like the place for me for a number of different reasons. I didn't even fully comprehend that at the time when I was younger, that maybe I'd have more liberties if I came here because of my disabilities. I was just attracted to the city life and the way it looked and the culture and the music here. I mean, I grew up in an area that was not culturally diverse, was very closed minded. I think even from a younger age, I knew in myself that I wanted to be around more variety of people and interests and art and everything. And New York obviously was the mecca for that. And I just loved the New York City aesthetic. I came here like a couple of times when I was. Once I hit 21, some friends, we came and spent a couple nights here. New York was just like as I imagined it. Loved it. It was still in the 90s, and it's amazing. So uh, I knew that I would hopefully end up here someday. Then when I had to get out of my situation, I would come here like once or twice a month, and I would just walk around all day and just try to get to know all of Manhattan and the neighborhoods, and just kind of suss it out. So I just loved it was peace of mind. I was able to get out of my house, which was just a not a good environment at all. And then the ability to take trains anywhere, any time of night, take a cab. All of a sudden, I was able to have somewhat of a normal life. Like I wasn't limited by my eyesight, and then going out in Pennsylvania and wondering whoever drove how much they drank, or
Mm.
being worried about getting in a car with somebody, or just not being able to get around. There weren't a lot of cabs back there, and they were expensive, and the cab drivers were kind of sketched back in Pennsylvania at that time too, before Uber. Like, you'd get a cab ride home, they were on some sort of drugs, and that wasn't a viable option. So coming here and getting a taste of that was just like, there's not many places in the world like that, right? So New York, it was just like kind of like the perfect candidate for a place to go to. I was able to get to and from bus access, so I could even get here on my own. And so it was that was what really brought me here, and that sealed the deal.
It's funny. Every time you say something, I get like four other questions that pop up in my head. Um, I guess so. The two questions that I have in my head after what you just said is one, what was the actual breaking point that gave you the final push that you wanted to leave? And then the second question is, I'm a New Yorker, right? Like, I've lived in New York basically my entire life. I am curious what it's like for an outsider, somebody who grew up in a completely different environment, to not just kind of acclimate themselves to the city as like a resident, but just to sort of like slowly have this experience unfold in front of them that's so polar opposite to what their experience was as they were growing up. I feel like I barely know any people anymore who were born and raised here. So plenty of people are transplants, but I'm wondering what the experience was like for you getting acclimated to the fact that New York is a very, very specific kind of place to live. And if you come from a suburban environment, if you come from a rural environment, it's going to be definitive culture shock.
hmm Well, the breaking point was pretty intense for me. Like, I had already, through my experiences at home, and not really sure where they're coming from, little developed severe panic and anxiety, and so I'm not sure what of that is genetic, but definitely some of it was environmental, and uh, I they were really intense, and I didn't receive any care for them. Part of the MO of the environment I was in was also like, no doctors, right? So I never. It took me a while to kind of come to terms and understand what like panic was. Like, the first time I had it, a panic attack, I thought I was dying. It was intense. Even though my dad did also have those, I still hadn't experienced it. By the time that things got really bad in the house, I had a point where I was had a mixture of anxiety and depression. I had a girlfriend, and that was sort of involved in the music aspect at the time. It was just all around not a good situation, and that kind of fizzled. But she was the first to sort of say like, "Hey, things aren't right here." And it started to connect some of the dots with me for some of the things I was feeling. Like, I didn't still necessarily understand, but things were reaching a breaking point for me working with him in that situation. I didn't know if I was going to quit music, period. I was
Oh,
so
wow.
like, what do I do with my life? I don't know if I can make music anymore. I spent maybe like a week in bed. And I was just drinking a lot, and I'd reached this low point, and I knew I couldn't continue on with the situation, because the situation of making music in that house had become so toxic for me and so painful that I just didn't know what to do. And it was like, I think for some people, they just would have walked away from all of it. And I wasn't sure if I was going to, but then I still felt somehow in there that music was beneficial to me, and that it was the environment that I was in that wasn't. And I still felt I could be connected with music and not have it be tarnished by that. So I guess after that really dark period of going through that, I started that's when I started trying to find some people locally to play with, because I knew I had to get out of that house a little bit and start playing with people. Well, and then it just kind of kept building more in there, and I started having more interactions with people, and then it just kind of ramped into that. Like, I don't exactly know what the final straw was, because it was a series of final straws, but I would say that particular week, where I bottomed out, like, where that was a major shift in my trajectory. That was it was survive or don't, like, it
Right.
was a kind of like turning point. Um, and so it took me a couple of years after that to get it all together, but that set the wheels in motion. Uh, and my coming to New York City, I feel like, was a different experience than it was for a lot of people. Because I talk to a lot of people come here, and they say things too, like, "Oh, it's such a polarizing experience," and it was not at all for me. I came here, and it was like I landed in home. It was
Huh.
like it was just this place of freedom and liberal-minded people, and people that loved their craft, and were good at it. I mean, all of a sudden I was around, like, people who were at their highest level of their field, and it was mentally stimulating. The freedom alone of being able to be in an apartment and just go out at night and hang out with friends and meet new people and come back home. And I think because of the contrast of where I was coming from, it was relief and it was salvation for me. And I loved it. I loved the subways. I loved the nightclubs. I loved the food. I loved the pace. It helped my anxiety, because a place that's constantly going 24/7, and there's a lot of excitement. Like, my mind is always going. Like, I don't relax very well, so my mind is always like buzzing. So being in a place that always buzzes was just like, this is great,
Right. Right. And you've already said it a couple of times, but New York is a place that welcomes people who are. This is a loaded word, and I'm not even sure I want to use it. That welcomes people who are outcasts. Like, if
Right.
you come from a small town or a suburban environment and you don't wear the same jeans, or you have blue hair, or you have a disability, or you're a different ethnic mix or a different sexuality or whatever it is, the thing that I love about New York, and I don't know if I still realize it so much because, again, this is where I'm from,
Hmm.
but this is a home for you. This is a place where people don't really care. I mean, not to say people don't care at all, people care a lot less about the thing that makes you stand out. And in
Yeah,
a lot of cases, the thing that makes you stand out is celebrated.
exactly. Yeah. And I really liked that, not only for myself, but I just liked being around people that were being themselves. Just that in itself felt liberating.
It really is. I think I might take that for granted a little bit. But hearing that perspective always makes me appreciate a little bit more just the value of A, being able to disappear in a city this big, and B, being able to find your people no matter what exactly your people are.
Hmm.
Like, no matter how niche your thing is, there's five other people in New York City who have the exact same niche.
Absolutely, yeah, and that was so fascinating to me, and I've taken advantage of that through a lot of my studies, because I know, like, here, and I'd seek people out and find people, and see, there's, if you into avant-garde music, there's places that focus on avant-garde music. You can really find something of everybody, and that wasn't where like that where I was from. I mean, I was the odd person out. So it was a very white, straight area, and particularly being in the 70s and 80s, it was very homophobic. And I don't think in high school I knew anybody who was nobody was outwardly gay. I think because it would have been really difficult for that time. It was just really a rough time. And so if you think of the narrow margin of people that you're around, like, my wife had a little bit of a different experience because of her family upbringing and stuff. She was around people that were a lot more open minded than were the areas that I were in, which were a lot tougher. But it was hard to just be different, you know.
Right. Speaking of Abby, I this is bugging me out a little bit. The fact that you two grew up near each other and had friend overlap, but didn't meet until you were both in Brooklyn.
Hmm.
How do you think that even happened?
I'm a little older than she is, and she'll remind me of that frequently. So we're not exactly in the same class, but it turns out that one of the people that was in the band I was in, that one that really got me out of Pennsylvania, that I was making good money from, knew Abby. And so there was crossover there. So I lived down the street from her when she was born. I was probably 7. And it's like, it was one of those things. Her family owned a pretty well-known jewelry store in the area. So it was like, I knew the name, and it was like, it was such an odd thing. But the thing about Pennsylvania in that particular area at the time, and I think it's changing a little bit now due to some of the people that are there now and the younger generation being more like mindful. It wasn't very inclusive with the arts. It was very like, you're on that side, I'm on this side. Like, you're in that band, we don't talk to people that are in that other band. It was very closed off that way, and she wasn't, and her family's not, but she was more in the folk scene, and I wasn't really in that scene, and I had limitation to going out and seeing a lot of new music because of my disability. So the
Hmm.
only time I met people was like if I was playing a gig, and there wasn't too many times it was more than one band on a gig back there. So we were sort of like ships passing in the night. You know what I mean? It was there. And when I moved to New York, we moved to New York 1 month apart from each other in the same year. um, a friend of mine in the band, Bob Lewis, who introduced us, he was like, "Oh, my friend Abby just moved to New York. I think you two would get along. She's a songwriter, and I'm age 30. It took me a lot to get out of Pennsylvania. I was just like, I'm not interested in anybody that's from that town right now. You know what I mean? I'm in New York. I'm here." And he was like, "No, she's really good." And it was the level back there at that time was not like I wanted more. I need to be challenged more by people who have achieved more in their abilities musically. And so there was part of me of knowing that the history of the place. I was just like, no. And finally, I caved. I went to back home to visit, and I saw her poster at a record shop, and I was like, huh, all right, I'll check her out. And then I checked her out. She had moved to Pittsburgh and went to college in Pittsburgh, and I checked her out, and she was really legit. Like, she was a great guitarist, a great songwriter, a great singer, and I was like, huh, okay. And so she likes to tell that story that I refused to contact her for a little while because but I finally did, and then I was of course highly impressed because she's the real deal, and so that's how we met,
And that there's a level, it feels fortuitous in a way, or serendipitous, or I'm not sure what the word is I'm looking for. One of those things. I mean, I do think some things happen for a reason, but given where you two came from, there feels like a destiny involved there.
Yeah, I feel
So
that way too. Yeah.
that's awesome. So, given all that you've experienced, how do you then make sense of that and move forward and don't let the negative experiences that you've had over the course of your life define the person you are now and moving forward?
It's been challenging. I think the first step was me understanding what I went through, and so a lot of therapy and support. I don't know if I would have achieved any of these things without Abby. And I think, just she tended to see always what's inside of me rather than what I had gone through and the effects of it. And so I think she was very persistent in her support and helping me get into therapy and work a lot of that stuff out to truly understand what I had been through. I didn't even know what emotional abuse was. So it took a lot of that to be able to recognize and say, this is what happened to me. And then from there on out, I think it was just years of then um, trying to deal with the anxiety and panic, but then realizing who I really am inside, and
Mm,
to try to like observe, because the last thing I want to do is repeat those scenarios or those experiences I went through. But of course, going through them sometimes for that long of a period of time in such isolation, some of these things start to feel natural because you don't have any counter experiences. So there's been a bit of me needing to reprogram myself to not act or react certain ways just based on repeated experience I've had. So I've had to really look at myself and just be like, well, who do I want to be, and who am I really inside, and break down the shell a bit, and sort of relearn maybe habits or how to deal with situations. Or so I'm just trying to research and talk to therapists and other people and read books about how to just be a better person in a lot of regards, or not to repeat the same behaviors. And it's an ongoing process. I feel like there's a lot of work to be done, and it is work because it's also acceptance of realizing that, well, you've done wrong yourself, and instead of being stubborn or egotistical about it or narcissistic about it, accepting that you make mistakes and that you can move on. I strangely enough think a lot of that came through. I've been working on this for years, but like during the pandemic, I really started studying classical composition and music harmony. Although I've studied music for a long time, I really got into writing for chamber orchestra and things of that nature, and like true classical harmony. And I really started getting very deliberate about my research in all forms of music, and got into like learning, and it became a thrill. And I think through that, learning how to learn and how to research, I think made me realize too, well, I don't just have to do this for classical counterpoint or avant-garde atonal composition. I can do this for thinking about how I can maybe get better at networking with people. I wasn't ever good at being social because I was hardly around people for the longest time.
Sure.
And I had to just learn mostly by coming to New York, and still there's things I'm not good at because of that. And also thinking like, well, maybe there's better ways that I can diffuse situations, or yeah, it's been a lot of things like that. Just willingness, I think, to want to change and put the time in to do it. But I think having a support system like Abby and a therapist has been uh, revolutionary.
Was the finding a therapist a decision that you made, or was it something that you made with the help of people who suggested it to you?
It was suggested. I wasn't into the idea because I think I was still coming from the stigma of that, and I never received help all the other years when I was having panic attacks and stuff like that. So I thought like, well, that's something I just do on my own. But there's a point where you can't do it on your own, and there was things I was never going to understand without it. So Abby was persistent about it, and eventually, because I trust her so much. Uh, and I think she sensed I was in a lot of pain, and I was really lucky. I found a phenomenal therapist that really has helped change my life. So that was a big thing. But yeah, Abby was the turning point. You know.
Man, it's so good to have people in your corner that lead you in the right direction. And obviously, if you're helping out somebody that you care about, there is some level of self interest in play there. But it really seems like this was a situation of, I love this guy. I want him to get better for himself.
Exactly, and that's one of the core things I fell in love with her about. There's numerous things, but one of them was she's genuine. Some people put on like I wouldn't say a costume, but they put on a bit of a character when they meet other people because this is my social person. This is who I am behind closed doors. But Abby is just really genuinely herself, and that genuine person that she is also a person that really, really cares about her friends. Like if you're her friends or you're her family, like she's got your back in a very deep level, and just really is checking in and aware of that stuff. And yeah, it's an incredible quality for a person to have, and an incredible for me to have landed in that situation, be lucky
Hey,
to
not a
have found
bad
her.
thing. Yeah. Has there been any acknowledgement or any kind of uh, reproachment with your blood relatives at all?
I'm very disconnected from my family. I cut him off a number of years ago. My mom finally got out of that situation. In order for that to happen, I knew those ties had to be severed, so I did, and it was toxic anyway. And so she finally got out because she was also in a bad situation. So I keep in touch with her. We're very close. Um, and on my mom's side, I still talk to a couple of relatives there, my uncle. And on my dad's side, I don't almost talk to anybody. His side of the family is very dysfunctional. Uh, I'm not really particularly close with too many people in my family because of the gap that was created for all those years with my dad sort of controlling both me and my mom. I never got as close as I would like to have. There were points in our life where we were poor, and we lived with my grandparents for a number of years with each of them. So I did get to know them at a young age, which was important. Um, but after they had passed, not really close. And I certainly, at least with my mom's parents, I wish I would have got to spend more time with them. But my dad definitely put up a wall between keeping them out a lot more so than his family. But he kept pretty much everybody out, but especially them. And my mom's brother, my mom's brother is gay and has been in a stable relationship for, I don't know, 40 years now. I have to check what the date is. I don't know. And to me, like, I've known his partner Jim for since some of my earliest memories are with both of them being at the um Christmas and stuff like that, where Howard and Jim would come to. Howard is my mom's brother, but that would be the only engagement because my dad also was homophobic, and so it was just always like a bit of an extra wall there,
Mm.
and saying things about them or this. It became difficult to really have a relationship or get to know them as much as I would have liked to because they're lovely people and like
Hey,
talk about love, right? I
40
mean that
years. Yeah.
and they've stuck by each other and really supported each other and in some ways it's like, well, being around them more is like the perfect role model for what love is supposed to be, right? Um, but that just didn't happen. So my engagement with extended family is limited. Unlike I'm getting more of that experience with Abby's family because their extended family is they're close, you know.
Right. Right. Um, you do so many things. Like you're composing music and you're gigging and now you're teaching. And New York is definitely like hustle culture. Everybody's got four different things that they do. How do you balance it?
It's hard. I mean, some of that is a necessity of modern living. And it used to be 30 years ago, you could have a career in one place. You could have been just a session musician or not just, but I mean, that could have been your focus. You go and you play on records or TV commercials or TV shows, films. That would be your job. And maybe you play some gigs for fun. But a lot of the industry has been deteriorated so much that it's really hard to just do one thing. So if you're going to do it sessions, you also have to do gigs, and then you might have to do some tours, and you're going to have to teach, and you're going to have to do. It's a lot. It's all like that. Or you have to be diversified in order to keep steady income. So. I guess I learned that, and I had a lot of interest in a lot of places, and I was able to execute them. So I naturally just kind of found work in them. But some of it's just out of necessity. Although I like all those things, I've definitely gone down some paths more than others just to facilitate making a full time living as an artist in New York.
Right. If you're going to do a bunch of things, it helps to like most or all of them.
Yeah, they all feed each other. I mean, I don't really see them now as being so separated. Right? So when I'm teaching my college students, that information is related to my the own research that I've done for myself or continue to do for myself. And if I teach a younger student, it sometimes makes me reevaluate my approach to an instrument. And so, although they look like on paper, they're different skill sets in my mind because of the blogs and the podcasts and the teaching I do, and I'm always gathering information. So any of these experiences I have allows me to further my progress as a musician artist. And it also allows me to share that with other people. So I'm looking to learn as much as I'm looking to share. I always have my antennae up and I'm just like, ooh, this is a new situation. How does this work? What's going on here?
Right. Is it interesting being a professor now? Do you have like a tweed jacket that you throw on or whatever to just get that professor look?
I have there's a punk store that I like to shop at a lot because I'm very much into early first wave and hardcore punk. They actually have some really cool Brit mod clothing, and Abby got me this sort of inspired Argyle sweater. So that's me bridging that gap. It's professor-ish, but it's all got a little punk edge to it. So kind of like riding that line, you know.
Right on. All right, I got one more question for you.
Sure.
You've spoken about anxiety before. Um, you talk a lot about really liking being stimulated by things. When I guess it's a two-part question. One, are there moments when you just want to like take a step back and chill? And when you do want have those moments, what do you do to do that?
That's been a real struggle for me. So I think prior to even this year, that was not something I was able to do at all. It got to a point where my baseline anxiety, where I was like, I think I'm okay, would probably be like DEFCON 5 for some people. So I just had to come to terms with like, this is not good. I can't live my life this way. And so I started taking anxiety medication and I was nervous and held off for years. I was afraid it was going to affect my creativity because I know some people it affects it. And I
Mm-hmm.
guess um I'm what some people I guess would label prolific, meaning I guess in the sense that like I could just continuously write music like nonstop if I was given the opportunity. I just constantly am creative. Um, and I got into that habit a lot because I was writing for a lot of TV shows and stuff. And sometimes that name of that game is how quickly can you put out music, right? Like I worked on that uh, a horror podcast, and like it was like the sort of thing where it was like, how much can you deliver? So I'm delivering like 5 cues in like slightly over 24 hours. Like that's like the speed of the business sometimes. Um, so I didn't want anything to tamper with that, and I held off and was considering it for a long time, but I was really nervous about that affecting it. But then I tried it, and it was like an instant life changer. It didn't take away my creativity at all. In fact, it helped my focus and my concentration. It helped everything. It was kind of I was at that moment where I was like, wow, I wish I was taking this for many years because
Mm-hmm.
for me, it really shifted a lot of things. And for the first time, without using alcohol, I was able to relax. And I think I was self medicating a lot with alcohol to try to just kind of take the heat down a little bit, right? So it was just a um, small flame instead of a full out like bonfire, right?
Right.
So I started to do things that were relaxing. I'm still not good at relaxing. I don't have any hobbies. Like my hobbies are reading classical scores. So I'll open up a Bach chorale or a composition from Arnold Schoenberg, or I'm reading Bill Evans' transcriptions to see how he's voicing chords, or that's like or reading theory books. Like I have a real thing for reading music theory books. Like I'm like my fifth counterpoint book. So I consider that relaxing. And sometimes I'm laying in bed doing that, and Abby seems to think that's not relaxing. She might be right. I bake sometimes. My
Okay.
mom has been teaching me her recipes, and sometimes I find that relaxing. But I I find it hard to just sit and watch TV. I'm trying to learn how to do that, to just get better at that. And as the anxiety is sort of calming down, I'm finding that I'm able to do that for longer periods of time where I just like sit down and watch TV. Like usually in the past, like my mind just has to be working and solving puzzles and busy and working.
Yep.
I got a Nintendo Switch to as a distraction, as a way to have something to do to allow myself like that isn't for like some goal because usually it's my mind's like I can't waste time. I have to learn this new concept about how Bella Bartok composed music. I need to learn this now. There's not much time left in life, and my mind is always doing that. And so playing Nintendo is sort of a departure for me because I'm doing something that doesn't have any real like life value in it in the sense of like goal, right? Except for solving Zelda or something, right? Literally just like wasting time, but in a good way. So I've been
Right.
trying to do more things like that, but that's been challenging to adjust and get into that because the environment it wasn't a relaxing place to be. So relaxing wasn't something that I never took vacations before I got in a relationship with Abby, never in my life, and so vacations and relaxing has been a later in life thing that I'm trying to adapt more and more, and I feel like it's happening more and more thanks to all the things I have now in place to assist with that, you know.
That's awesome, and I think it's really important. I saw the pictures of you on vacation maybe a month or so ago, and I'm like, look at Mark hanging out on the beach.
I didn't take any music theory books. We didn't take any instruments. And I will admit, I did download Tchaikovsky's book on theory and read a little bit when I was there, but like mostly, not too much though. I waited at least 4 days in 5 days in before I read anything about it. And I still think it was fairly casual reading, but most of the time was just us on the beach and then going to the hot tub and and going to dinner like completely like disarmed, which was amazing.
It's super important, man. You gotta do a little bit more of that just for the sake of balance. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm starting to see that now. I'm trying to implement it more. I'm starting to understand and appreciate it more now in this part of my life.
Good deal, man.
Also,
All
not
right.
seeing it as like a definitive end, right? Like it's just a continuous journey rather than it
Yeah,
being an end goal that you have to get to of a certain level.
yeah. And I do this as well. It's like, okay, well, I'm not going to pause until I do this thing, this thing, this thing, X, Y, Z, and this other thing. And while I do think it's important to set goals, it's also important to just relax. Like you need to recharge. Particularly as you get older. We're not the Energizer bunnies we used to be. And it's important not just for our bodies to relax. It's important to find things to do to get our brains to relax.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Very
so
true.
particularly for active minds, anything that can maybe slow that down for a little bit, whether it is a video game or reading a book, maybe not a music theory book, but different strokes for different. Thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time out of your schedule, and thank you for being so open. And I really appreciated hearing your story again because we've talked about it privately. I hope that other people can hear what you're talking about and apply that to themselves. You can find Mark on Instagram at guitarist_Mark_Marshall. Mark does a lot of interesting musical things that, again, go way above my very limited head of musical comprehension. You can also check out Mark's podcast. It is called Anatomy of Tone. You can find it wherever podcasts exist. And Mark is a special guy, and I hope you enjoyed listening to him talk. Thank you for listening to Detoxicity. I hope you found this particular episode interesting. And if you are new, I hope you go back and listen to all of the older episodes. Once again, my name is Mike Joseph. I am the host and producer of this show. And there are a lot of things that you can do to continue to support our mission, continue to support this podcast. Follow me on social media. I am on Instagram, Twitter, and I'm on TikTok as DetoxPod Guy. You can also send me an email if you'd like. I'm at detoxpod@gmail.com. I am always on the hunt for people with interesting, inspirational, and powerful stories. So if you know somebody who fits that bill, or if you yourself fit that bill, please don't hesitate to drop me a line via email or via social media. Please make sure you subscribe on your podcast platform that you're listening to this on. Rate, comment, help a brother out, help us move up in the rankings. Follow me on social media. Like I said, follow our Patreon, or subscribe to my Patreon, actually. Patreon.com/detoxicitypod. You get access to exclusive episodes. You get episodes a little earlier than the general public. You get a cool ass sticker, lots of stuff. Once again, patreon.com/detoxicitypod. Quick shout out to Calvin Williams for providing the music and doing his magic on the logo, which was originally designed by Jacob Block. I thank you all for listening. I wish you all the best. Please take care of each other. Till next time, peace.